A young widow. No guarantees, no roots, just a promise in her heart and a faith that pushes her to abandon everything. This is the starting point of Ruth, a Moabite woman with no great expectations for the future, who ends up changing the history of Israel and becoming the ancestor of the Messiah himself. What leads someone to give up their land and their people, to plunge into an uncertain destiny alongside a grieving mother-in-law? What was so special about Ruth that made her embrace the faith of the God of Israel, without guarantees, without promises of glory? Ruth is not an obvious heroine. She has no power, no wealth, no noble lineage. But it's her unbreakable loyalty and defiant courage that make her God's unlikely choice to be part of an eternal plan. In a world where commitments are fragile and relationships ephemeral, Ruth's commitment makes us question the value of true fidelity. She defies conventions, breaks cultural barriers and builds a legacy with actions that touch the heart of God and echo to this day. Ruth's every step, no matter how humble it may seem, carries a divine purpose. His life reveals to us that true greatness is not in appearances, but in the faith we embrace and the choices we make. Ruth calls us to reflect. What if our actions were also part of something much bigger? His journey is an invitation to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and to trust that even in our moments of greatest uncertainty, God is able to weave an amazing future. In the heart of Israel's arid lands, a terrible famine ravaged the people, pushing entire families to despair and forcing many to seek a new life away from their ancestral soil. Thus, Naomi and her family made the difficult decision to leave Bethlehem for Moab, a strange country full of distinctive traditions and customs. What Naomi didn't know was that her journey would lead her to meet a young Moabite woman named Ruth, whose name would become synonymous with loyalty and courage for generations. Ruth's story intertwines with Naomi's in a time of tragedy, but also of hope. This scenario, which seems only suffering, is actually the stage for one of the greatest testimonies of faith and redemption. And so begins their journey. In Moab, Naomi sees her life fall apart when she loses her husband and later her 2 sons. The pain of these losses was undoubtedly overwhelming. Her family was now reduced to her and her daughters-in-law. Ruth, one of the daughters-in-law, emerges in this moment of mourning as a figure of unparalleled strength and devotion. Although the norms of the time suggested that she return to her family, Ruth decides to stay by Naomi's side, renouncing everything she knew. Imagine someone who, instead of seeking security, chooses the uncertain, motivated by faith and commitment to her mother-in-law. At a time when family alliances were fragile and often bound only by convention, Ruth's act defies norms and transforms the relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law into a journey of faith. What motivates a young woman, in a time when women had few choices, to abandon everything for a compromise? Ruth saw in Naomi not only a mother-in-law, but a connection to something greater. His decision to leave for Bethlehem was not a simple gesture of compassion. It was an act of deep faith, a leap into the unknown. She was aware of the dangers and rejection she might face in Israel, a place where the Moabites were viewed with suspicion. But this awareness did not stop her. On the contrary, it gave her the determination to face any obstacle in the name of a promise she had made, both to Naomi and to herself, to live true to the commitment she had made. At every step, Ruth demonstrates that true loyalty transcends barriers. In one of the most emblematic passages in biblical history, Ruth responds to Naomi's request to return to Moab with a phrase that echoes to this day: "Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. His people will be my people, and his God will be my God." It's not just words. They are the manifestation of a heart that has chosen to ally itself with a faith, a lineage, and a promise that it did not even fully know. It is a statement of commitment and trust, not only with Naomi, but with the God of Israel, whom she decided to worship, even though she did not know what the future held for her. This oath shows that Ruth's faith was unshakable, for she saw something greater than the safety and comfort of her homeland. When she sets foot in Bethlehem, Ruth finds a land that, although it belonged to her husband, was not hers. She arrives with no riches or status, only with the courage of a woman who had left everything behind. She accepts the risks of being a foreigner in a land that was still recovering from hunger, and with a humble heart, begins to work in the fields. There was nothing glamorous about the work of harvesting ears of barley left for the poor, but for Ruth, each ear represented a chance for her and Naomi to make a living. It is here that the virtue of their diligence and humility shines most brightly. Ruth's tireless effort in the fields would soon catch the attention of someone special who would change their lives. And then Boaz enters the scene. Boaz, a relative of Naomi, was a man of character and integrity who watched intently as Ruth strove. He saw in this young Moabite girl a courage that few in Israel exhibited. Seeing her working in the fields, he offers her protection and security, asking her to continue harvesting among his servants, also guaranteeing her water and rest. Boaz symbolizes God's provision for those who seek him with a pure heart. He represents the Redeemer kinsman, someone who is willing to go above and beyond to protect and rescue his family's lineage. But this meeting, more than a coincidence, was a work of divine providence that was already preparing the way for redemption. Time passes, and Naomi realizes the role of Boaz in their lives. She instructs Ruth about Israelite customs and how to ask for redemption from her lineage. Ruth, out of obedience and respect for her mother-in-law, follows the instructions and approaches Boaz in a subtle way, according to tradition. This seemingly simple gesture reveals Ruth's humility and trust in Naomi's guidance and God's providence. More than a marriage proposal, Ruth's act in Boaz's field is a request for redemption, a plea for him to assume the role of redeeming relative. And in responding to this request, Boaz responds with kindness and honor, seeing in Ruth a loyalty that transcends any personal interest. The union of Boaz and Ruth brings unexpected rewards. They have a son, Obed, who would be the grandfather of King David, one of Israel's greatest leaders and later one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. Ruth's lineage is inserted in the genealogy that culminates in the Messiah, uniting the story of faith of a foreigner with the redemption of all humanity. The birth of Obed is not just a family legacy, it is the seal of a history of faith and rewarded faithfulness. The woman who once worked in the fields of Bethlehem was now respected and blessed. His trajectory proves that God does not choose the powerful, but the humble and loyal to carry out his will. And so, Ruth's story continues to inspire generations with her message of loyalty, redemption, and divine purpose. Ruth was faced with a choice that would forever change the course of her life. Upon hearing Naomi's recommendation to return to Moab, the young Moabite woman could have taken the easy route, returning to the comfort of her family and her culture. But her soul seemed drawn to something greater, something she found in the company of her mother-in-law and the God of Israel. When Ruth answered with the words, "Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. His people shall be my people, and his God shall be my God," his decision was much deeper than a simple promise. There she chose faith in a God she barely knew, but whom she wanted to follow with all her heart, trusting that he would show her the way. The commitment that Ruth demonstrated is one of those that touch the heart and make us reflect on what fidelity really means. She wasn't just making an emotional choice or following a momentary instinct. His decision was the result of a sincere determination which transcended social and cultural pressures. In her engagement to Naomi, Ruth expressed the same faith she found in Israel, a faith that believed in divine provision even when life seemed bleak and uncertain. In every word of her promise, Ruth conveyed an assurance that Naomi's God would sustain her even in a foreign land. By committing herself to the God of Israel, Ruth opened the door to a life of purpose and redemption. Imagine what it's like to leave behind everything you know, traditions, family ties, a homeland, and go towards the uncertain. Ruth threw herself into this adventure because her heart was already united to the people of Israel and to Naomi's faith. It was as if she was saying, "Whatever the price, I am willing to pay, because I have found in your God something that gives meaning to my existence." This type of surrender is rare, as it requires a trust that goes beyond what we can see or understand. Ruth knew she would face hardships, but she was willing to embrace them, believing that this new faith would sustain her, even when everything around her was hostile. By choosing the God of Israel, Ruth became not just a foreigner in a new land, but a foreigner who had decided to put her life in the hands of that God. And in this total surrender, she came to represent the hope of all those who approach God, even without fully understanding Him. By following Naomi, Ruth symbolized those who find in God a new home, a place where the promises are true and where people, even from different backgrounds, are accepted and valued. In her heart, Ruth carried the commitment to serve a God who makes no distinction of race or origin, but who welcomes all who sincerely seek Him. Ruth's dedication to Naomi teaches us something essential about the nature of true commitment. Often the world encourages us to seek what is easy and convenient, but Ruth shows us that true commitment requires courage and determination. By choosing Israel as her new land and God as her new Lord, Ruth was not only seeking a physical shelter, but a spiritual home, where she would find a greater purpose. She understood that by following God, life might not be easier, but it would be more meaningful. And it was this vision of meaning that sustained her on her journey. For Ruth, faithfulness was more valuable than any temporary security she could find in Moab. Ruth leaves us with a practical lesson. Commitment to God and to the people we love must be constant, even in the face of difficulties. When we make the decision to trust God, we make room for Him to work in our lives, even when the results are not immediately visible. In Ruth's case, this unwavering commitment led her to a destiny she could never have imagined. Her faith and faithfulness were seen not only by Naomi, but also by God, who began to open doors for her in Israel. By choosing God and Israel, Ruth was choosing a path of redemption, even though she did not know it at the time. When the Bible relates Ruth's words, we understand that she was not just a young woman willing to follow her mother-in-law. She represented all those who are called out of their comfort zones for a greater purpose. His faithfulness inspires us to do the same, to commit ourselves to those we love and to God, even if we do not understand the whole road ahead. His life is a testimony that when we put our trust in God, He acts in ways we could never have foreseen. Ruth's every step to Bethlehem was a step of faith, and that faith would soon prove more rewarding than she could have ever imagined. Thus, Ruth's decision to follow Naomi and the God of Israel was not a simple choice, but a deep covenant, a total surrender that only those who truly love are capable of making. And it is this commitment that marks the beginning of a new phase in her life, a phase that would lead her to an unexpected future and blessings that would surpass generations. Ruth's commitment resonates with all who seek a greater purpose in their lives, for by choosing God, she became a vital link in the lineage of Israel, a lineage that would culminate in the Messiah. And so the story of Ruth reminds us that true faithfulness finds rewards beyond what meets the eye, preparing us for the next chapter of her journey. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth is faced with a new reality. Although the decision to leave Moab and go with Naomi was made in faith, now the young Moabite woman must face the practical challenges of survival in a foreign land. Hunger and poverty are constant threats, and Ruth wastes no time. She decides to seek sustenance, even if it means doing humble and heavy work. His attitude reveals a disposition that transcends any pride. She is not afraid to roll up her sleeves and go to the fields, where the workers harvested barley. This work, reserved for the poorest, demonstrates her humility and determination to provide for her and her mother-in-law. Working in the fields, especially as a foreigner, was not only physically exhausting for Ruth, it was also a social risk. In Israel, vulnerable women were subject to suspicious looks and cruel comments. However, Ruth does not allow the fear of rejection to paralyze her. On the contrary, she sees the work as an opportunity to show her character and her willingness to honor the commitment she made to Naomi. In many ways, Ruth's effort is an act of practical faith which transcends words and manifests itself in actions. She does not expect charity, but seeks with her own hands the sustenance for herself and her mother-in-law, an action that would become a testimony to her character and faithfulness. It is in this environment that Ruth catches the attention of Boaz, the owner of the field where she worked. Boaz, who had heard of Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, observes with admiration the dedication of the young Moabite girl. He sees in her a spirit of humility and service that stood out, even in a society accustomed to social and cultural divisions. As he approaches Ruth, Boaz praises her for her courage and offers her protection. He invites her to continue harvesting in her fields, assuring her of water and security. In this gesture, Boaz not only shows compassion, but reveals the role of the redeeming relative, a concept so important in Israelite culture that would become central to the story of Ruth. God's providence begins to manifest itself clearly in Ruth's life. She ended up in the field of a man who, in addition to being generous, was a relative of Naomi. The encounter with Boaz is not a mere chance, but a demonstration of the way God cares for those who act with faithfulness and humility. It is as if, with each ear she harvested, Ruth was reaping the blessings that God had in store for her and Naomi. In her hard work and humility, we see that Ruth's faith was not just theoretical. She put that faith into action, day after day, harvesting in the fields to survive, and at the same time letting herself be guided by the opportunities God placed before her. Boaz is moved by Ruth's story, and his words reveal the respect he feels for her. He praises her for leaving her land and her family, choosing to live among a people she did not know. Boaz realizes that Ruth's courage is unusual and that her faith in God is genuine. He prays that the Lord will reward the young Moabite woman for all she has done for Naomi. This meeting between Ruth and Boaz goes far beyond a simple conversation between a landlord and a worker. It is the meeting of two souls who, in different ways, sought to live in fidelity to God and His principles. And it is in this fidelity that both find a greater purpose. At a time when many would seek shortcuts, Ruth teaches us that the path of honesty and hard work has a value that transcends the moment. While harvesting the ears of grain in the fields, Ruth is planting at the same time the seeds of a life that will be rewarded. And this is a principle that we can apply in our own lives. By dedicating ourselves to something, even in the simplest tasks, we show our value and build a legacy. Ruth's example invites us to do the same, to realize that every job, no matter how simple, has the potential to reveal character and set the stage for future blessings. Ruth's work, as simple as it may seem, carries a profound message of redemption and hope. In the field, she not only ensures sustenance for herself and Naomi, but also leaves a living testimony of loyalty and humility. It is in the act of reaping day after day that Ruth expresses the strength of her faith. Your willingness to serve and work honestly becomes an offering that God receives and turns into blessings. And by dedicating herself in this way, she also teaches that every task, no matter how humble, can be an act of worship and a path to redemption. For Ruth, the field was more than a place of work. It was the setting where his story of fidelity unfolded. The time in Boaz's camp would mark the beginning of a new phase for Ruth, a phase where her commitment would be honored and her faithfulness rewarded. Unknowingly, in doing her work, Ruth was being prepared for something greater. God used the most ordinary tasks of her life to lead her to an eternal purpose. And so Ruth's work teaches us that even when we don't understand what's coming, each day of dedication and service has a meaning that goes beyond what we see. Ruth's story intertwines with Boaz's, and together they will be part of a larger plan, revealing how God uses even the fields to lead His children to the fulfillment of His promises. Observing Boaz's kindness and the way he showed care for Ruth, Naomi realizes that there could be more to this story than just an act of generosity. As an Israelite woman knowledgeable about the traditions of her people, Naomi understands that Boaz, being a close relative, could play the role of redeemer for her family's lineage. According to the law of Israel, there was a sacred tradition called kinsman redeemer, where a close relative had the opportunity to marry the widow of a deceased relative to ensure the continuity of that family. This practice was not only a form of support, but also of honor to the lineage and legacy. And it was precisely this role that Naomi envisioned for Boaz. To Ruth, This idea was a mystery, something new and loaded with symbolism that went beyond her Moabite traditions, but confident in her mother-in-law's wisdom, she agrees to follow his instructions. Naomi suggests that Ruth go to Boaz at the place of threshing at night and lie down at his feet. Although it may seem like an odd gesture to today's eyes, this action carried a deep meaning of humility and respect. Lying at Boaz's feet was a plea for protection and a search for security that only a redeemer could offer. Ruth trusted that God was guiding every step of this journey, and so she followed Naomi's words, willing to accept Israel's tradition as part of her new faith. The meeting between Ruth and Boaz in the calm of the night is one of the most touching moments in history. When Boaz finds her at his feet, he understands the depth of Ruth's gesture. She, with delicacy and respect, asks him to cover her with his cloak, a symbol of protection and acceptance as his wife. Boaz is moved by Ruth's request and praises her for her kindness and loyalty, remembering that she could have sought richer or more powerful young people. Boaz's heart recognizes that this young Moabite woman was not after interests, but rather an alliance based on faith and commitment. He treats her with honor, showing that he understood the value of her request. Boaz, however, realizes that in order to fulfill the role of Redeemer, he needs to follow the laws of Israel with integrity. There was another man closer to Naomi who also had the right to redeem the line. Boaz, being a righteous man, decides to respect the order of the laws and seek this person first to ensure that everything is done correctly. Boaz's commitment to righteousness is a reflection of his faith and the responsibility he felt to follow traditions. He promises Ruth that he will do everything in his power to honor her request, and this promise fills Ruth and Naomi's hearts with hope. More than just an agreement, this commitment is a reflection of God's covenant with his people. The figure of the Redeemer in Israel was not only a matter of family obligation, but also a symbol of protection and grace. By accepting Ruth's request, Boaz was willing to take on the responsibility of caring for and protecting this family. For him, being the redeeming relative did not only mean ensuring the continuity of a lineage, but offering security and dignity to those who needed it so much. Boaz was the representation of God's mercy, which sustains those in need and offers a new beginning to those who choose to live in faithfulness. He was assuming a role of honor, to which he committed himself in the name of justice and compassion. This act of redemption that Boaz was about to fulfill was also a representation of God's care, which never abandons those who seek him. Boaz was the instrument of divine providence, bringing a light of hope to Ruth and Naomi. In the silence of a night and in the humility of a request, God manifested himself in a subtle but powerful way. Ruth, who had once been a helpless foreigner, now found a home and a purpose. The law of the Redeemer was not just an ancient tradition, it was a way for God to reveal that no one is forgotten and that he cares for those who sincerely seek him. For Ruth, this tradition of the Redeemer brought not only a home, but also the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She was about to find a family and a place in Israel's history. By choosing to follow God, Ruth had been welcomed into a foreign land, and now she was on the verge of seeing her commitment rewarded in an extraordinary way. The figure of the Redeemer, which Boaz was willing to be, is a symbol of the way God acts. He provides a way even when everything seems impossible. And Boaz's promise to care for Ruth reveals the character of a God who honors commitment and rewards faithfulness. Boaz's commitment to being Ruth's Redeemer invites us to reflect on the role of redemption in our lives. Just as Ruth found a Redeemer in Boaz, each of us is called to seek the one who offers us redemption. The Israelite tradition of the kinsman redeemer is a symbol that God offers us a path to rescue and restoration, even when all seems lost. Boaz's attitude reminds us that true redemption requires sacrifice and commitment. And like Ruth, we are called to accept that protection with humility, knowing that God is always willing to rescue and care for those who surrender to him. With Boaz's commitment to being the redeeming kinsman, Ruth's life is transformed in an extraordinary way. The union between Boaz and Ruth is not just a marriage, it is the realization of a story of faithfulness, where Ruth's perseverance and faith are rewarded with a new home and a family. The birth of his son, Obed, marks the beginning of a legacy that surpasses expectations of an ordinary life in Israel. Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, will grow up to be the grandfather of David, the great king of Israel. This son, the fruit of the covenant between a Moabite woman and an Israelite, will become a fundamental part of the lineage that will culminate in the Messiah Jesus Christ, a testimony of the greater purpose that God had for this story. Ruth's life and her journey of faith show us that God is able to transform humble and simple lives into powerful stories of redemption. When the women of Bethlehem celebrate the birth of Obed, they exclaim, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not failed to give him a redeemer today." And they recognize in Ruth a woman whose faith has elevated her to a place of honor, even though she is a foreigner. It was not often for a Moabite woman to be accepted with such appreciation in Israelite society, but God used Ruth's faithfulness to build a legacy that would bless Israel forever. This recognition of the women of Bethlehem is also a reminder that when we are faithful, God grants us a reward that is noticed by everyone around us. Obed, the son of Ruth, becomes a symbol of the promise fulfilled, an inheritance that represented the continuity and hope of Israel. He is not just the result of a union, but a link in a chain of events that God had planned for the redemption of his people. In telling the story of Ruth, we see that every act of faithfulness and every choice, no matter how small, has the potential to impact the future in profound ways. Ruth, who was once a needy foreigner, is now the mother of a direct descendant of the royal line of Israel. And as she looks at her son, she can see not only the continuity of her family, but also the faithfulness of God, who sustained her at all times. Ruth's legacy is proof that God does not choose people based on their background, but rather based on their willingness to serve and their faith. His story is an eternal lesson for all who feel inadequate or out of place, showing that God can welcome us and lift us up, regardless of where we come from. Ruth became a respected woman, honored as one who, by embracing faith in the God of Israel, was rewarded in a way that surpassed any human expectation, and its presence in the genealogy of Jesus is a reminder that, in the history of God, there are no excluded. Everyone has a fundamental role in the divine plan, just choose to follow with faith. The story of Ruth and Boaz teaches us that true love and commitment bear fruit that goes beyond the present, creating deep roots that influence future generations. Ruth's love for Naomi and her commitment to Boaz are not limited to a simple marriage story, but are the foundation of a lineage that God chose to bring salvation to the world. Leaving behind her land and culture, Ruth embraced a new beginning that led her to be part of a divine work. His legacy is not just a son or a family, but the continuity of a promise, of a lineage that would bring light to all humanity. Ruth inspires us to see our own lives with a new eye, understanding that every choice and every step of faith has the power to impact far beyond what we can see. Just as she found in Israel a home and a purpose, we are invited to pursue our own mission and build a legacy that influences and inspires those around us. Ruth's actions were guided by an unconditional love and a faith that stood firm in the face of any difficulty. At every moment, his life challenges us to think about what values and principles we are willing to cultivate and leave as an inheritance. Ruth's reward of being part of David's lineage, and eventually Jesus's, was not something she could have planned or hoped for. And that's what makes his story so special. It teaches us that when we surrender our lives to God, He is able to do infinitely more than what we imagine. Obed's birth was a blessing, but for Ruth, it was also the fulfillment of a promise that her faith would be rewarded. And this is the invitation that his story makes to all of us, to live with a faith that transcends the immediate, trusting that God can transform even the most ordinary circumstances into eternal blessings. Ruth's legacy lives on today as a testimony that faithfulness and commitment will always find their reward. As we look back at your life, we can see that God is faithful to fulfill every promise, and that even in the most difficult times, He is preparing something greater than we can understand. And so Ruth, the young Moabite woman who was once a foreigner in Israel, becomes one of the most honored women in biblical history, remembered as an example of faith, loyalty, and redemption. With her journey, Ruth teaches us that true legacy is not built on power or status, but on choices that reflect love and faithfulness. Ruth's story, which begins with grief and loss, concludes as a narrative of redemption and hope. The young Moabite woman who set out on an uncertain path alongside Naomi found in Israel not only a home, but a family and a greater purpose. At every step, from working in the fields to marrying Boaz, we see how God leads the lives of those who sincerely seek him. Ruth went from a needy widow to one of the most important figures in the history of Israel, inserted in the royal and messianic lineage. It is a transformation that few could have predicted, but one that reveals God's power to act in the simplest and most unexpected details of our lives. In the end, we understand that Ruth's story is not just about a foreign woman looking for survival. It's about how loyalty and commitment can transform destinies. Ruth found in Israel not only a new land, but a new faith that would shape her forever. Ruth's every act of faithfulness did not go unnoticed in God's eyes, and he rewarded that faith in a way that echoes to this day. In the birth of Obed, his son with Boaz, we see the fulfillment of God's promises and a demonstration that he honors those who, even without fully understanding the future, choose to follow it with humility and dedication. The story of Ruth also reminds us that God makes no distinction between people. Ruth, a Moabite, is accepted and blessed in Israel, being elevated to a place of honor in the history of the chosen people. In many ways, Ruth's life reflects the reality of all those who, even if they are outsiders, are called to be part of God's plan. This inclusion of Ruth in the lineage of Jesus shows us that God welcomes all who sincerely seek him, regardless of their origin or background. And so Ruth becomes a symbol that God always opens doors for those who, like her, have a faithful heart and desire to know him. More than a love story between Ruth and Boaz, this is a love story between God and his people. Boaz, as a redemptive relative, represents the care and provision of God, who always seeks to rescue and protect those who are under his covenant. In Boaz, we see a reflection of God himself, who, in his mercy, acts on behalf of those who love him. Ruth is welcomed and protected, not because she deserves it, but because God sees her heart and her reward. It is a story that transcends time and reminds us that God's love for us is deep and unconditional, offering redemption to all who approach him with humility. Ruth's life challenges us to rethink what it means to live with purpose and faithfulness. She did not seek riches or glory. Her priority has always been to take care of Naomi and honor the commitment she made. And by living this way, she became part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. Ruth teaches us that when we put others and our faith in God first, life takes on a new meaning, and we are led on a journey where every act of kindness and commitment becomes a link in a chain of blessings. His story invites us to reflect on our own choices and the way we are building our legacies. Ruth's legacy also reminds us that God is able to use the most unlikely situations to fulfill his plan. Ruth, a foreigner without possessions or connections, becomes one of the most important links in the genealogy of Jesus. It gives us hope that even when our lives seem directionless, God is working on our behalf. He transforms the most adverse circumstances into opportunities for growth and redemption. Like Ruth, we are invited to trust that in God's hands, even the most difficult times can lead us to a future full of purpose and blessings. At the end of her story, Ruth leaves us a message that true redemption comes not only from position or possessions, but from the willingness to serve and trust. She, who began her journey as a widow with no future, ends up as a mother and ancestor of King David, inserted in God's eternal plan for the salvation of humanity. And that's the beauty of Ruth's story, a reminder that in God we all find redemption, even when life seems uncertain. Her unwavering faith is an invitation for us, like her, to surrender from the heart and trust that God is with us at every step of our journey. The story of Ruth, which began with struggles and uncertainties, leaves each of us with a valuable lesson. Faithfulness always finds its place, and true reward comes from commitment to God and to those we love. As we look to Ruth, we are inspired to live with purpose, to cultivate faith, and to pursue a life that is a blessing to others. And so Ruth's legacy lives on, inspiring us to live in ways that honor our faith and build a future that reflects the love and redemption we find in God. Now that you have learned about Ruth's story in depth, the challenge remains: what would you do if you had a faith as intense as hers? What would it be like to live with the courage to embrace the uncertain, believing that each step can be part of something great? Ruth showed us that true faithfulness, whether to God or to the people we love, opens doors to an amazing future. And perhaps most impressively, even though she didn't know what awaited her, she chose to trust. The question that remains is, are you also ready to take this step of faith in your own life? If this powerful example inspired you, think about how you can apply the same determination. What can you change today to live in a more committed way? Are you building a legacy with your actions and choices? Ruth shows us that no matter where we come from or our circumstances, there is always a chance to turn our story into something extraordinary. If this journey has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue diving into stories like this and learn how to bring more purpose and faith into your own life.